The stagecoach rattled into La Junta, Colorado territory, on a Thursday afternoon in late August 1878, bringing with it the only thing drier than the parched earth itself, a woman who had traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger. Penelope Richardson pressed her gloved hand against the coach window, squinting through the dust at what would become her new home. The town looked desperate, like a patient in the final throes of fever. Buildings stood gray and weathered under a merciless sun that had turned the sky white with heat. Not a single cloud marred that terrible expanse of blue. The Arkansas River, which should have been running strong through the valley, was reduced to a muddy trickle that wouldn't quench the thirst of a dying dog. "This it, miss," the driver called down, his voice hoarse from breathing dust for the past 30 miles. Penelope gathered her carpetbag and stepped down onto soil so dry it crunched like broken glass beneath her boots. She was 22 years old, auburn-haired, and possessed of the kind of practical beauty that came from good bone structure rather than powder and paint. Her gray traveling dress was coated in a fine layer of Colorado dust, and she knew her face probably was too, but there was nothing to be done about it now. A man stood waiting outside the general store, hat in his hands, squinting against the sun. Penelope knew him immediately from the single daguerreotype he had sent to Boston 6 months ago. Gideon Wells, cattle rancher, 30 years old, widowed 3 years prior. He was taller than she had expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of hard work and a face weathered by sun and wind into premature lines around his eyes and mouth. "Miss Richardson." His voice was deep, uncertain. "Mr. Wells." She extended her hand, and he took it carefully, as though she might shatter if he gripped too hard. "I am sorry you have arrived to this." He gestured vaguely at the dying town, the cracked earth, the skeletal cattle visible in distant pens. "When I wrote to you, when we began this correspondence, the drought had not yet taken hold so completely. If you wish to return on the next stage, I would understand completely. I would pay your passage back to Boston." Penelope studied him carefully. His eyes were gray-blue, like storm clouds she prayed might someday return to this forsaken place. There was honesty in them, and exhaustion, and something that might have been hope dying slowly like everything else in this town. "I did not travel 1,500 miles to turn back at the first sign of hardship, Mr. Wells. The advertisement you placed specified a wife, not a fair-weather visitor. I am here, and I intend to stay if you will have me." Something flickered across his face then, relief mixed with something deeper. He settled his hat back on his head and reached for her bag. "Then welcome to La Junta, Miss Richardson, and please call me Gideon." "Penelope," she replied, "though my mother called me Penny." "Penelope," he repeated, as though testing how the name felt in his mouth. "It is a good, strong name." They walked together down the main street, past the saloon where a few dejected men sat on the porch seeking shade, past the bank with its windows shuttered against the heat, past the small white church with its bell tower reaching toward that pitiless sky. Gideon pointed out landmarks as they went, his voice carrying an undercurrent of apology for each one. "That is the Mercantile, though old man Henderson has precious little to sell these days. Most supplies must come from Pueblo now, and with the railroad struggling and the drought, well, things are dear. The doctor's office there, Doc Morrison, good man when he is sober, which admittedly is less often now than it used to be. The schoolhouse, though Miss Peters left last month, could not take the heat and the hopelessness any more." "And the church?" Penelope asked, nodding toward the building. "Reverend Talbot. He holds services every Sunday still, though the congregation grows smaller each week as families give up and move on. He has agreed to marry us tomorrow, if that suits you." Tomorrow. The word hung between them like the heat shimmer rising from the ground. They were still strangers, yet in less than 24 hours they would be bound together for life. Penelope felt her heart hammer against her ribs, but she kept her voice steady. "Tomorrow will be fine." Gideon's wagon waited at the end of the street, hitched to 2 horses that looked as worn as everything else. He helped her up onto the seat, his hands strong and sure around her waist, and then climbed up beside her. As they rolled out of town toward his ranch, Penelope took in the devastated landscape. Fields that should have been golden with wheat stood empty and bare. Cattle clustered in what little shade could be found, their ribs showing through their hides. The earth itself seemed to have given up, cracked into patterns like broken pottery. "How long has it been since rain?" she asked. 73 days, Gideon said without hesitation. "Not a drop since the first week of June. Before that, we had a dry spring. The river is down to nearly nothing. Wells are running dry. I have a good well on my property, deep and strong, but even that is giving less water each day. I have lost 30 head of cattle already, and I will lose more before this is over. You should have told me in your letters." He glanced at her, those storm cloud eyes troubled. "Would you have come?" Penelope considered this honestly. "I do not know. Perhaps not. I will not lie and say I am not frightened by what I see here, but I am here now, and I do not break my word once given." "That is more than I had a right to expect." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "My wife, my first wife, Sarah, she died giving birth to our son. The baby died too. That was 3 years ago come September. After that, I could not bring myself to court anyone, to risk that kind of loss again. But a ranch is no place for a man alone, and I found myself growing as dry and barren as this land. When my neighbor suggested I might write to one of those agencies back east, I thought perhaps it was a way forward. Then I saw your letter, your photograph, and I thought maybe God had not entirely forsaken me after all." The rawness in his voice made Penelope's throat tighten. "I am sorry for your loss, Gideon. I cannot imagine such pain." "And your own reasons for leaving Boston?" he asked gently. "You never said much in your letters, only that you sought a fresh start." Penelope watched the dying land roll past. "My parents died of influenza 2 years ago within days of each other. I was working as a seamstress, living in a boarding house, and I realized one day that I could spend the next 40 years doing exactly the same thing, growing old in a cramped room, making dresses for other women to wear to events I would never attend. And then I would die having never really lived at all. When I saw your advertisement, something in it called to me. A life in the West, hard work, open sky, a true partnership with someone, it seemed worth the risk. Even now, seeing this," she looked at him directly. "Especially now, you need someone, Gideon Wells. This land needs someone. And I find I need to be needed." His face softened then, some of the worry lines easing. "Then perhaps we will do well together, Penelope Richardson, after all." The ranch house came into view over a low rise. It was a simple structure, wood frame, painted white once though the paint was peeling now. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and there were flower beds that had clearly once been tended with care but now held only brown stems and dust. A barn stood behind the house, and several outbuildings, corrals, a windmill that creaked in the hot breeze as it pulled water from deep beneath the ground. "It is not much," Gideon said, pulling the horses to a stop in front of the house. "But it is sound, and the roof does not leak, and the well still gives good water." "It is more than I had in Boston," Penelope said truthfully. "It is a home." He helped her down and carried her bag up onto the porch. Inside, the house was dim and blessedly cooler than the outside air. The main room served as kitchen and sitting area both, with a stone fireplace, a cast iron stove, a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs, and 2 worn armchairs positioned near the hearth. Everything was clean but spare, the home of a man who had been living alone too long. "There are 2 bedrooms," Gideon said, a flush creeping up his neck beneath his sun-browned skin. "I have prepared the larger one for you. I will take the smaller room until after we are married tomorrow. I want you to know that I am a man of honor, Penelope. You are safe here." "I never doubted it," she said softly, and realized she meant it. There was something fundamentally decent about Gideon Wells, something solid and trustworthy that had come through even in his carefully penned letters. He showed her to the bedroom, which held a brass bed covered with a faded quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a chest of drawers, and a single window that looked out over the brown fields toward distant mountains. After he left her to settle in, Penelope sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She was in Colorado territory, 1,500 miles from everything she had ever known, about to marry a man she had met for the first time less than 2 hours ago. But she was not one to give in to fear or uncertainty. She rose, washed the travel dust from her face and hands with water from the pitcher, changed into a simpler dress of pale blue cotton, and went to find Gideon. He was in the barn, forking hay down from the loft for his horses. He had removed his shirt in the heat, and Penelope caught sight of broad shoulders slick with sweat, muscles moving beneath tanned skin. She felt something stir in her that she had not expected to feel, an awareness of him as a man rather than simply the practical solution to her uncertain future. He saw her and quickly grabbed his shirt, pulling it on. "I apologize. I did not expect company out here." "It is your home, Gideon. I should apologize for interrupting your work. I came to ask what I might do to help. I am not accustomed to sitting idle." He considered her for a moment, then nodded. "Can you cook?" "I can." "Then if you could manage supper, I would count that a great help. There is not much in the larder, I am afraid. Some beans, some bacon, flour for biscuits. I have been eating simply these past months." "I will see what I can do." Back in the house, Penelope explored the kitchen, taking inventory. He had not been exaggerating about the sparse supplies. She found beans, bacon, flour, salt, a bit of sugar, coffee, some withered potatoes, and a jar of preserved tomatoes that must have been from before the drought. She set about making biscuits, soaking beans, slicing bacon, and when Gideon came in an hour later, drawn by the smell of food cooking, she had a simple meal laid out on the table. They ate in companionable silence at first, but gradually began to talk. He asked about Boston, about her life there, and she told him about the boarding house with its narrow stairs and thin walls, about the seamstress shop where she had worked 12 hours a day for wages that barely kept her fed. He told her about the ranch, about growing up in Kansas before coming to Colorado territory to claim land of his own, about the good years before the drought when the grass grew tall and the cattle were fat. "I had dreams of building something lasting here," he said, pushing beans around his plate. "A real ranch, maybe 2,000 head of cattle, breeding stock, the best in the territory. I wanted to build a bigger house, have a family to fill it. Sarah and we had those plans together. Then she died and the plans died with her. For 3 years I just went through the motions, keeping the ranch going but not really building toward anything. Then this drought came, and I realized I had to either fight for what I wanted or give up entirely. Writing to that agency, asking you to come here, that was me deciding to fight." "Then we will fight together," Penelope said firmly. "I did not come here to watch everything fall apart. There must be something we can do." "Water is everything," Gideon said. "If we can keep the well producing, keep the cattle watered, then we can survive until the drought breaks. And it will break eventually. It always does. The question is whether we can last that long. That night, lying in the unfamiliar bed in the darkened bedroom, Penelope listened to the wind rattling the windows and the distant lowing of thirsty cattle. She had told Gideon she was not afraid, but alone in the darkness, she could admit to herself that she was terrified. What if the drought never broke? What if the well ran dry? What if she had come all this way only to watch everything wither and die? But then she thought of Gideon's face when she had said she would stay, that flicker of hope in his storm cloud eyes, and she felt something strengthen in her. He needed her, this place needed her, and she would not fail them. She woke to the smell of coffee and found Gideon already in the kitchen, dressed in his best clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He looked younger somehow, less careworn, and when he saw her, he smiled tentatively. "Good morning." "I thought, given that today is our wedding day, I should at least make coffee. I'm afraid that is the extent of my breakfast skills." Penelope laughed despite her nervousness. "Coffee is more than sufficient. Give me a moment to dress, and I will make something proper." She returned to her room and pulled out the dress she had brought for this purpose, a simple gown of dove gray silk that had been her mother's. It was not a traditional wedding dress, but it was the finest thing she owned, and she had altered it to fit her figure. She pinned up her auburn hair, pinched her cheeks for color, and studied herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like a woman about to make the most important decision of her life, which was exactly what she was. When she emerged, Gideon stood from the table, his eyes widening. "You look beautiful, Penelope." "Thank you." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." They drove back into town in the wagon, the morning sun already hot despite the early hour. La Junta looked no better in daylight than it had the previous afternoon, but Penelope tried to see past the drought, to imagine what this place might look like with rain, with green fields, with hope restored. The church was small and dim inside, cooler than the outside air. Reverend Talbot waited at the altar, a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle voice. He greeted them both warmly, asked a few questions to establish their intent, and then began the ceremony. There were no other witnesses except the Reverend's wife, a plump woman who smiled encouragingly at Penelope throughout. The words of the marriage service washed over her, familiar from a dozen weddings she had attended in Boston, yet entirely different now that she was the bride. When Gideon took her hand and repeated his vows, his voice was steady and sure, and she felt the warmth of his palm against hers, the calluses earned from hard work, the strength in his fingers. Then it was her turn, and she heard her own voice saying words that would bind her to this man, to this place, for the rest of her life. "I, Penelope Richardson, take you, Gideon Wells, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do us part." "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Talbot said. Gideon leaned down, his eyes searching hers for permission, and then his lips touched hers, gentle and brief but carrying within it the promise of more to come. When he pulled back, they were married. Outside the church, they stood blinking in the bright sunlight, and Penelope felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. She was a married woman now, bound to a man she had known for less than a day, in a place suffering under drought and hardship. "Are you all right?" Gideon asked quietly. "I am," she said, and realized it was true. "I am exactly where I need to be." They stopped at the mercantile to purchase a few supplies, and old man Henderson peered at Penelope with undisguised curiosity. "So you are the mail-order bride we heard tell was coming." "Brave woman, coming out here in the middle of all this. Or foolish," Penelope said lightly. "No, madam, brave," Henderson insisted. Gideon here is a good man, one of the best. You have chosen well, even if the land is not cooperating just now." As they left the store with their small bundle of supplies, they encountered several more townspeople who had heard of the wedding. All of them greeted Penelope kindly, welcomed her to La Junta, and offered their wishes for rain. It seemed the entire town's survival hung on that single hope: rain. They returned to the ranch in the heat of midday, and Gideon tended to the horses while Penelope put away the supplies. The day stretched ahead of them, their wedding day, and Penelope felt suddenly awkward. What did one do on one's wedding day when there was a drought to fight and cattle to water and a marriage to somehow begin? Gideon seemed to share her uncertainty. He came into the house and stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, watching her put flour in the bin. "Penelope, I want you to know that I do not expect anything from you. Tonight, I mean. We are married in law and in the eyes of God, but we are still strangers to each other. There is no rush for anything." She turned to face him, this man who was now her husband. "I appreciate your consideration, Gideon, truly. But we are married now, and I do not believe in half measures. I would like us to begin this marriage as we mean to continue it, as true partners in all ways." Something flared in his eyes, relief and desire mingled together. "You are certain?" "I am certain." He crossed the room then, slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but she stood her ground. When he reached her, he cupped her face in his hands, rough palms against her smooth cheeks, and kissed her properly this time. Not the chaste brush of lips from the church, but a real kiss, deep and searching. Penelope felt heat bloom through her body, felt her hands come up to grip his shoulders, felt herself responding to him with an intensity that surprised her. "You are the rain I have been praying for," he murmured against her lips. "All these months of drought, of dryness, of nothing growing, and then you arrive like a storm I did not dare hope for." His words, so raw and honest, made her throat tighten with emotion. She pulled him down for another kiss, pouring into it everything she could not yet say, all her hope and fear and desperate determination that they would survive this together. He lifted her then, carried her to the bedroom that was now theirs, and laid her gently on the bed. The afternoon light filtered through the thin curtains, casting everything in a golden haze. He undressed her slowly, reverently, and she him. And then they came together with the fierce need of two people who had been alone too long, who had found each other in the midst of devastation, and chosen to build something new. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the sheets, sweat cooling on their skin in the hot room, and Penelope felt more settled than she had since her parents died. This was right. She did not fully understand why yet, but she knew it in her bones. "Tell me about Sarah," she said quietly. "Your first wife, I want to know about her." Gideon was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "She was small, dark-haired, always singing. She made this house feel alive. When she died, it was like all the music went out of the world. I did not think I would ever want to hear singing again. Do you mind that I am not like her? No." He turned to face her, brushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "You are different, and that is good. I loved Sarah with my whole heart, and I will always carry that love with me. But she is gone, and I am still here, and I find that I want to live again. You make me want to live again, Penelope." She kissed him softly. "Then we will live, Gideon Wells. We will live and fight and survive this drought together." Over the following days, they fell into a rhythm. Penelope rose with the sun and made breakfast while Gideon tended the animals. After eating, they worked together to water the cattle from the well, a laborious process of hauling bucket after bucket to the troughs. The well was still producing, but Gideon watched its level obsessively, measuring each day to see how much it had dropped. Penelope took over the vegetable garden, such as it was, trying to coax life from plants that looked more dead than alive. She watered them carefully from the kitchen gray water, unwilling to waste a single drop. Most of the plants were beyond saving, but a few tomato vines and some struggling beans showed signs of life. In the evenings, after the worst heat of the day had passed, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the brown fields, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. Gideon would tell her about the ranch, about his plans for when the drought broke, and Penelope would listen and add her own ideas, her practical Boston mind finding ways to make his dreams more achievable. "We should diversify," she said one evening, about a week after her arrival. "If we rely only on cattle, we are at the mercy of the water. But chickens need less water, and they produce eggs we can sell. A few pigs, perhaps, for meat. A larger vegetable garden when the drought breaks. We should not put all our hopes in one basket." Gideon listened carefully, nodding. "You are right. I have been so focused on the cattle because that is what I know, but you are thinking more broadly. We could do those things. We should do those things." They grew closer each day, learning each other's habits and preferences, learning how to work together, learning how to be married. At night, they came together with increasing familiarity and tenderness, and Penelope found herself falling in love with this quiet, strong man who had taken a chance on a mail-order bride in the midst of disaster. But the drought did not ease. September arrived with no rain, just more relentless sun and heat. The well level continued to drop, inch by inexorable inch. More cattle died despite their best efforts. Other ranchers in the area began abandoning their land, loading what they could into wagons and heading east, back to places where water still flowed. "We could leave too," Gideon said one night, the words clearly painful for him. "Go to Kansas, to my family's land. They would take us in until this passes." "Do you want to leave?" Penelope asked. "No, this is my land, my home. I built this with my own hands, but I will not sacrifice you to my stubbornness. If you want to go, we will go." Penelope thought about this carefully. Life here was harder than anything she had experienced in Boston. Her hands were chapped and blistered from hauling water. Her skin was sunburned despite her best efforts. She was tired all the time, and she went to bed each night wondering if tomorrow would be the day the well ran dry. But she looked at Gideon, at the fear and determination warring in his face, and she knew what her answer had to be. "I married you for better or worse, remember? I am not ready to give up yet. As long as we have water, we have a chance. We stay." Relief flooded his face, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You wrote a very persuasive advertisement," she said, making him laugh, which was becoming one of her favorite sounds. The next morning they woke to a strange stillness in the air. The usual hot wind had died completely, and the sky had taken on an odd yellowish tinge. Gideon stood on the porch, studying the horizon with narrowed eyes. "Storm coming," he said. "Not rain, though, dust." Penelope had heard of dust storms but never experienced one. "What do we do?" "Secure everything. Get the animals into the barn. Seal the house as best we can. These storms, they get into everything, and they can last for hours." They worked frantically, bringing the horses into the barn, herding the chickens Penelope had recently acquired into their coop, closing all the shutters on the house, stuffing rags into the gaps around doors and windows. By the time they finished, the yellow sky had turned brown and the wind had begun to howl. The storm hit like a physical blow. Wind screamed around the house, rattling the shutters, finding every tiny crack and crevice. Dust seeped in despite their best efforts, coating everything in a fine brown layer. They retreated to the bedroom with wet cloths tied over their faces to help them breathe, huddling together on the bed as the world outside disappeared into a churning brown nightmare. It lasted 6 hours. When it finally passed and they ventured outside, the landscape had been transformed. Dust lay thick over everything, drifted against the buildings like brown snow. The cattle that had survived stood coated in it, looking like ghostly statues. The well was capped with dust. Everything they owned was buried under a layer of grit. Penelope looked at the devastation and felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying would not help. They had to clean up, had to keep going, had to survive. They worked for days to clean everything, to dig out from under the dust, to restore some semblance of order. And through it all, no rain came. October arrived and still no rain. The well level dropped further. They were rationing water now, using as little as possible, drinking warm and dusty rather than wasted on cooling. "I spoke with Jim Patterson in town yesterday," Gideon said one evening in mid-October. "He is abandoning his place, heading to California. He said we are fools to stay." "Do you think we are fools?" Penelope asked. "Some days," Gideon admitted. "Some days I think we should cut our losses and go. But then I look at you, at how hard you work, at how you have never once complained, and I think maybe we are not fools. Maybe we are just stubborn enough to survive." "I prefer to think of us as determined," Penelope said with a small smile. That night, lying in bed with Gideon's arm around her, Penelope whispered, "I think I am with child." She felt him go still beside her. "Are you certain, not completely certain, but fairly sure?" "I have missed my monthly courses twice now, and I have been feeling ill in the mornings. All the signs point to it. A baby." His voice was thick with emotion. "Penelope, we are barely surviving as it is. How can we bring a child into this?" "People have been having babies in difficult circumstances since the beginning of time," she said practically. "We will manage. Life does not stop because of a drought, Gideon. Life continues, babies are born, and we do the best we can." He pulled her close, his face buried in her hair. "I am terrified," he admitted. "After what happened with Sarah, with the baby, I am so terrified." "So am I," Penelope said honestly. "But we will face it together, just like we have faced everything else." The next several weeks passed in a haze of work and worry. They continued their daily routine of rationing water, tending the dwindling herd, fighting to keep their small piece of the world alive. Penelope's pregnancy progressed, bringing with it morning sickness that was particularly unwelcome when she was already tired and overworked. But she refused to let it slow her down, refused to give in to the exhaustion that dogged her steps. In early November, as they sat at breakfast, Gideon said, "The well is nearly dry. Another week, maybe 2 at most, and we will have no water left." Penelope set down her coffee cup carefully. "Then we need to act now, not later. What are our options?" "There is a spring in the mountains about 15 miles north. It is on government land, free for anyone to use, but it is a hard trip through rough country. We could take the wagon, load up barrels, and bring back enough water to last us a while. It would mean doing that trip regularly, maybe once a week, until the drought breaks or we give up entirely." "Then that is what we will do," Penelope said firmly. "When do we leave?" "You should not go," Gideon said immediately. "Not in your condition. The trip is too rough, too hard. I will go alone. And leave me here with no way to get water if the well runs dry while you are gone. No, Gideon, we go together or we do not go at all. I am pregnant, not fragile. I can handle a wagon ride." He looked as though he wanted to argue, but he must have seen the determination in her face because he finally nodded. "We leave tomorrow at dawn. It will take us most of a day to get there, a day to rest and fill the barrels, and another day to get back. 3 days total." They spent the rest of that day preparing. Gideon loaded empty barrels into the wagon, along with food supplies, blankets, and his rifle. Penelope packed carefully, trying to think of everything they might need. That evening they went to bed early, knowing they would need to be up before dawn. The trip into the mountains was every bit as hard as Gideon had warned. The road, such as it was, consisted of little more than wagon ruts winding through increasingly rough terrain. The wagon jolted and bounced over rocks and through gullies, and Penelope had to grip the seat to keep from being thrown off. But she kept her complaints to herself, focusing instead on the mountains rising ahead of them, purple against the blue sky. By mid-afternoon, they began to climb in elevation, and Penelope noticed the vegetation changing. The brown, dead grasses of the plains gave way to scrubby bushes, then to scattered pine trees that grew thicker as they climbed higher. There was still evidence of the drought here, but it was less severe, as though the mountains had held onto some vestige of life that the plains had lost entirely. They reached the spring in the late afternoon, and Penelope nearly wept at the sight of it. Water, clear and cold, bubbling up from between rocks and flowing down the mountainside in a small stream. It was the first running water she had seen since arriving in Colorado territory, and it seemed like a miracle. They made camp near the spring, and while Gideon tended to the horses, Penelope knelt by the water and plunged her hands in, gasping at the cold. She splashed her face, her arms, letting the water wash away weeks of dust and grime. When Gideon joined her, they simply sat for a while, listening to the sound of flowing water, a sound they had nearly forgotten existed. "Tomorrow we fill the barrels," Gideon said. "But tonight, let us simply rest and be grateful for this." They ate a simple supper and sat by their campfire as darkness fell. The air was cooler here in the mountains, a relief after months of unrelenting heat. Stars appeared overhead, so many stars that Penelope felt dizzy looking at them. "I have been thinking," Gideon said quietly. "If we can make this trip regularly, if we can haul enough water to keep the cattle alive, we might make it through. It will not be easy and it will be constant work, but it is possible." "Then we will do it," Penelope said. "Whatever it takes." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I keep thinking about what you said when you first arrived, about needing to be needed. I need you, Penelope, more than I have ever needed anyone. You are the strongest person I have ever known." "I am not strong," she said. "I am just stubborn. There is a difference." "No, you are strong. You had a comfortable life in Boston, or at least a predictable one, and you left it all to come here, to this drought-stricken place, to marry a stranger. And then you stayed when anyone sensible would have left. You have worked yourself to exhaustion every single day without complaint. You are carrying our child in the midst of all this hardship, and you are still ready to fight. That is not stubbornness, Penelope. That is strength." She felt tears sting her eyes and let them fall this time, here in the darkness where he could not see. "I love you, Gideon Wells. I did not expect to, not this quickly, not this deeply, but I do. I love you." His hand tightened on hers. "And I love you, Penelope Wells. You are my rain, my storm, my salvation. I will spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you." They held each other as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, and for the first time since arriving in Colorado territory, Penelope felt something like peace. The next day they filled the barrels, a laborious process of hauling water from the spring to the wagon bucket by bucket. By late afternoon, all 6 barrels were full, and the wagon sat low on its axles under the weight. They rested the horses for another hour, let them drink their fill from the spring, and then began the long journey home. The trip back was slower, the wagon heavier, and they had to stop frequently to rest the horses. They camped again that night on the plains, guarding their precious cargo of water. Penelope lay awake for a long time, listening to Gideon's steady breathing beside her, thinking about the life growing inside her, about the future they were fighting so hard to build. They reached the ranch in the late afternoon of the third day, exhausted but triumphant. Together, they set up a system for dispensing the water carefully, making sure every drop was accounted for. It would last them a week, maybe a bit longer if they were careful, and then they would have to make the trip again. And they did. Every week through November and into December, they made the 3-day journey to the mountain spring and back, hauling water to keep their cattle and themselves alive. It was back-breaking work, made harder by Penelope's advancing pregnancy, but they persisted. Other ranchers heard what they were doing, and a few joined them, forming a small caravan that made the trip together for safety and companionship. Winter arrived, bringing with it cold but still no significant snow. The drought continued unabated, but Gideon and Penelope had found their rhythm, had learned how to survive through sheer determination and hard work. Christmas came and went quietly, marked only by a special supper and a gift of a carved wooden horse that Gideon had been making for the baby in what little spare time he had. In January, Penelope woke one night to cramping pains in her abdomen. She lay still for a moment, trying to determine if this was the beginning of labor or something else. The baby was not due for another 2 months, too early, far too early. "Gideon," she whispered urgently, "wake up." He came alert immediately. "What is wrong? I am having pains." Something is wrong with the baby. Fear flashed across his face, the same fear he must have felt when Sarah went into labor, but he pushed it down, focused on the immediate need. "I will ride to town, get Doc Morrison." "There is no time, and you know Morrison is a drunk. Stay with me, Gideon. Whatever happens, I need you here." The pains intensified over the next hours, and Penelope knew with terrible certainty that she was losing the baby. She curled on her side, weeping not just from physical pain, but from the loss of the life they had hoped for. Gideon held her, helpless in the face of her suffering, murmuring words of comfort that neither of them believed. By morning, it was over. The baby was gone, lost before it had ever really begun. Penelope lay exhausted and hollow, staring at the ceiling as gray dawn light filtered through the window. She felt Gideon's hand in hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, and she could not bring herself to look at him. "I am sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry." "This is not your fault," he said fiercely. "Do you hear me, Penelope? This is not your fault. Sometimes these things happen, and there is nothing anyone could have done. But after Sarah, after your son, I know how much you wanted this baby. I want you," he said, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard, but his voice was steady. "The baby would have been a blessing, but you are what I need. You are what I cannot lose. Do you understand me?" She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They held each other as the sun rose over the drought-stricken land. Two people who had lost something precious but still had each other. The weeks that followed were dark ones. Penelope recovered physically, but the emotional wound took longer to heal. She went through the motions of daily life, but the spark had gone out of her. Even the weekly trips to the spring, which had become routine, felt pointless now. What were they fighting for? Why were they killing themselves to save a ranch when everything they tried to build was doomed to fail? Gideon watched her with worried eyes, but seemed unsure how to help. He tried to give her space to grieve while still being there when she needed him. It was a difficult balance, and Penelope knew he was suffering too, not just from the loss of the baby but from watching her hurt and being unable to fix it. February arrived, and with it, the first real snow of the winter. It was not much, just a few inches, but it was moisture, and that was something. Gideon stood on the porch watching the snow fall, and Penelope joined him, wrapped in a shawl against the cold. "It is a start," he said quietly. "Not enough to break the drought, but a start." "Do you really think it will ever end?" Penelope asked. "Sometimes I think this is just how life is now, and we are fools to keep fighting." He turned to her, cupping her face in his hands. "We are not fools, we are survivors. Look at everything we have been through, Penelope. You traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger. We have survived dust storms and drought and loss. We have made that terrible trip to the spring and back more times than I can count. We have buried our child and kept going. That is not foolishness. That is courage." "I do not feel courageous," she admitted. "I feel tired and sad and worn down to nothing. I know. I feel the same way some days, but we have each other, and that is not nothing. That is everything." She leaned into him, letting him hold her, and felt something loosen in her chest. He was right. They had each other. Everything else could be rebuilt, replanted, regrown. But if they lost each other, there would be no recovering from that. March came with more snow, and then in early April the clouds rolled in thick and gray and stayed. The rain began on a Tuesday morning, a light drizzle at first that had Gideon and Penelope standing on the porch in disbelief, faces turned up to the sky, letting the drops fall on their skin. "It is raining," Penelope said wonderingly. "Gideon, it is actually raining." The drizzle strengthened to a steady rain and then to a downpour. It rained all day and into the night. It rained the next day and the day after that. The Arkansas River began to rise. The dry gullies filled with running water. The earth, so long parched and cracked, began to soften and heal. After nearly a year of drought, the rains had finally come. When the storm finally cleared after 5 days of steady rain, the world looked transformed. Green was already showing in the fields, dormant seeds that had waited through the long, dry months now springing to life. The cattle, those that had survived, lifted their heads with renewed energy. The well, which had been down to nearly nothing, refilled. "We made it," Gideon said, standing on the porch with his arm around Penelope, surveying their land. "Against all odds, we actually made it." Penelope leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling lighter than she had in months. "We did. Together." Over the following weeks, the land continued its miraculous recovery. Grass grew thick and green. Wildflowers bloomed in riots of color. The river ran full and strong. Other ranchers who had abandoned their land began trickling back, sheepish but hopeful. La Junta itself seemed to wake from a nightmare. Businesses reopening, people smiling again, children playing in the streets. Gideon and Penelope threw themselves into rebuilding what the drought had damaged. They expanded the herd with new cattle purchased at good prices from desperate sellers in still dry areas. Penelope planted an enormous vegetable garden, determined to have food put by for whatever hardships might come. They built a chicken coop big enough for 24 birds and bought breeding stock of pigs. In early June, a full year after the drought had truly taken hold, they stood together looking at fields green with new grass, at cattle growing fat, at a garden bursting with vegetables, and at a ranch that had not just survived but was thriving. "I have been thinking," Penelope said, "about trying again. For a baby, I mean." Gideon looked at her carefully. "Are you sure? After what happened before, I am sure. The doctor said there was no reason I could not have a healthy baby, that sometimes these things just happen. And I think about how close we came to giving up, to walking away, and how glad I am that we did not. I want to try again, Gideon. I want us to have a family to fill this house." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "Then we will try, and whatever happens, we will face it together." By late summer, Penelope suspected she was pregnant again. This time, she waited longer to be certain, waited until the signs were unmistakable before telling Gideon. When she finally did, On an evening in early September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, his face transformed with joy and terror combined. "I will be terrified every day until the baby is born," he admitted. "But I am also so happy I can barely stand it." "Then we will be terrified together," Penelope said, taking his hand. This pregnancy progressed differently than the first. Penelope felt stronger, healthier, and the morning sickness was less severe. She continued working on the ranch, though Gideon insisted she not overdo it, and she felt the baby grow inside her with a sense of wonder and hope she had not allowed herself before. Winter came and went, a normal winter with good snow that would mean good water in the spring. The ranch continued to prosper. They hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heavier work as Penelope's pregnancy advanced. The house began to feel like a real home filled with their life together, their dreams, their love. In March of 1879, on a warm afternoon with spring flowers blooming outside, Penelope went into labor. This time, Doc Morrison was sober and capable when Gideon brought him to the ranch. This time, the labor progressed normally, naturally, the way it was supposed to. And in the early evening, as the sun set over green fields and a running river, Penelope gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel, after Gideon's father, and when the doctor laid him in Penelope's arms, she looked down at his tiny red face and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Gideon sat beside the bed, one arm around Penelope, one finger gently touching Samuel's tiny hand, and his face was wet with tears. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for him, for staying, for everything." "He is ours," Penelope said softly. "Born from struggle, born from love, born from refusing to give up. He is everything we fought for." The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Samuel was a healthy, hungry baby who demanded constant attention. Penelope was tired all the time, but it was a different kind of tired than the drought exhaustion had been. This was the tiredness of caring for new life, of nighttime feedings and endless diaper changes, and walking a fussy baby around the house at 3 in the morning. Gideon proved to be a devoted father, taking his turn with late-night duties, spending his free time holding his son and talking to him about the ranch, about cattle, about everything and nothing. Watching him with Samuel, Penelope felt her love for her husband deepen even further. The ranch continued to thrive. With good rainfall, good grass, and careful management, they built the herd to over 200 head. The vegetable garden produced abundantly, and Penelope spent long hours preserving food for winter. The chickens laid steadily, and the pigs grew fat. They were not rich, not by any means, but they were prosperous in the way that mattered, with food enough, money enough, and love more than enough. On a warm evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch with Samuel sleeping in Penelope's arms, Gideon said, "Do you ever regret it? Coming here, I mean. Agreeing to marry a stranger, enduring everything that first year." Penelope considered the question seriously. She thought about the dust and the drought, the endless trips to the mountain spring, the loss of their first baby, the fear and uncertainty and bone-deep exhaustion. Then she looked at Gideon, at Samuel, at the ranch spread out before them green and alive, and she smiled. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Every hardship we faced brought us to this moment, to this life. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "You are still the rain I prayed for," Gideon said softly. "You brought life back to this place, to me. Everything good in my life flows from the day you stepped off that stagecoach. And you are the home I did not know I needed," Penelope replied. "The partner I always wanted, the love I thought I might never find. We saved each other, Gideon." He leaned over to kiss her, gentle and sweet, and Samuel stirred between them, making the small snuffling sounds that meant he would wake soon, hungry again. Penelope laughed softly, and Gideon joined her, and the sound of their laughter carried out over the fields, over the running river, over the land they had fought so hard to keep. As the months turned to years, their family grew. A daughter named Elizabeth arrived 2 years after Samuel, and then another son named Jacob 2 years after that. The house rang with the sounds of children playing, arguing, learning, growing. Samuel learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, shadowing his father around the ranch with the determined intensity of a firstborn son. Elizabeth proved to have her mother's practical mind and her father's way with animals. Jacob was still a toddler but already showed signs of being the most stubborn of them all. The ranch expanded as well. They bought the neighboring property when old man Patterson died and his children wanted nothing to do with ranching. More cattle, more land, more opportunities. They built a new barn, enlarged the house, added a proper smokehouse and root cellar. What had been a desperate attempt at survival became something truly substantial. La Junta grew too, benefiting from the railroad and from ranches like the Wells spread, bringing prosperity to the area. The town got a new school, a new church, additional businesses. The drought of 1878 became the story old-timers told to newcomers. A tale of hardships survived, of communities that refused to die, of the resilience of the human spirit. Other mail-order brides arrived over the years, drawn by advertisements from lonely men seeking wives. Penelope always made a point of welcoming them, remembering her own arrival, her own fears and uncertainties. She helped them adjust to life in the West, gave them advice on managing households on the frontier, and offered friendship when they needed it most. On a crisp October afternoon in 1884, 6 years after Penelope's arrival, she and Gideon stood on the porch watching their children play in the yard. Samuel was teaching Elizabeth how to rope a fence post while Jacob toddled after them, determined not to be left out. The sun was warm, the sky brilliantly blue, and the field stretched green and gold in all directions. "You remember what you said to me that first day?" Penelope asked. "When you met me at the stagecoach, I offered to send you back to Boston," Gideon said with a rueful smile. "Not my finest moment. But then later, you told me I was the rain you had been praying for. Do you still feel that way?" He pulled her close, his arms solid and warm around her shoulders. "Every single day, you are my rain, my storm, my everything. You brought life where there was drought, hope where there was despair. Everything I have, everything I am, I owe to you." "We owe it to each other," Penelope corrected gently. "We built this together, survived together, loved together. That is what marriage is, Gideon. Not one person saving the other, but two people choosing each other every day in good times and bad." "Then I choose you," he said. "Today and every day for the rest of our lives." "And I choose you," she replied. They stood together as the afternoon light turned golden, watching their children play, watching their cattle graze in green fields, watching the life they had built from nothing but determination and love. The wind carried the smell of grass and rain, of growing things and new life, and Penelope thought about the girl who had stepped off that stagecoach 6 years ago, frightened but determined, and smiled at how far she had come. She had been looking for a new beginning, for a life that mattered, for a purpose beyond the narrow confines of her Boston boarding house. She had found all that and more. She had found a partner who respected her strength, loved her completely, and built a life with her that was richer than anything she could have imagined. The drought had been terrible, the hardest thing she had ever endured, but it had forged them both into something stronger. They had learned what they were capable of, learned that they could survive anything as long as they faced it together. That knowledge was a gift, even if it had come wrapped in suffering. "Look, Mama," Elizabeth called, successfully roping the fence post. "I did it." "Well done, my darling." Penelope called back, and Gideon squeezed her shoulder, proud of his daughter's accomplishment. That evening, after the children were bathed and tucked into bed, after the animals were fed and the house was quiet, Penelope and Gideon sat by the fire in the main room. She was mending a shirt while he worked on the ranch accounts, and the scene was so perfectly domestic, so utterly normal that Penelope had to pause and appreciate it. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked, noticing her stillness. "I am thinking about how grateful I am," she said simply. "For this life, for you, for our children, for everything. 6 years ago, I was alone in the world, working myself to exhaustion just to survive, with no prospects and no hope for anything better. Now look at me. Look at us. We have built something wonderful, Gideon." "We have," he agreed. "And it is not finished yet. We have years ahead of us, more children to raise, more cattle to breed, more dreams to chase. This is just the beginning, Penelope." She smiled at his optimism, his eternal hope for the future. That was what she loved most about him, perhaps, his refusal to be defeated, his ability to keep believing even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He had believed they could survive the drought when everyone else was giving up. He had believed in their marriage when they were still strangers. He believed in their future, and his belief made her believe too. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing children. Samuel turned into a tall, serious young man who took after his father in both temperament and skill with cattle. Elizabeth remained fiercely independent, insisting on learning everything the boys learned and usually doing it better. Jacob grew into a charming troublemaker who could talk his way out of any punishment. A fourth child arrived when Penelope was 30, a daughter they named Sarah after Gideon's first wife. Penelope had suggested the name, wanting to honor the woman who had come before her, and Gideon had wept when she proposed it. Little Sarah proved to be a quiet, thoughtful child who loved books and spent hours reading everything she could get her hands on. The ranch continued to prosper through the 1880s, surviving smaller droughts and economic downturns through the careful planning and diversification Penelope had insisted on from the beginning. They weathered the terrible winter of 1886 and 87, when blizzards killed cattle across the plains, because they had built adequate shelter and stored sufficient hay. They survived the cattle market crash of 1889 because they had other income streams from crops and other livestock. Through it all, Penelope and Gideon remained partners in every sense of the word. They consulted each other on major decisions, supported each other through difficulties, celebrated successes together. Their marriage deepened and matured, the passionate romance of their early years evolving into something even stronger, a bond forged through shared struggle and shared joy. On their 15th wedding anniversary, in August of 1893, Gideon surprised Penelope with a gift. He led her outside after supper to find a beautiful painted sign that read Wells Ranch, established 1878, Gideon and Penelope Wells, proprietors. "We built this together," he said. "Your name belongs on it as much as mine does." Penelope touched the sign, running her fingers over her own name, and felt tears prick her eyes. In an era when women's contributions were often overlooked or minimized, this public acknowledgement of her partnership meant everything. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me, for valuing me, for making me your true partner." "How could I do anything else?" he replied. "You are the strongest, smartest, most capable person I know. This ranch exists because you refused to give up when anyone sensible would have run back to Boston. You are the foundation everything else is built on, Penelope. That night, as they lay in bed, Penelope thought about the journey that had brought her here. The young woman who had responded to a mail-order bride advertisement, desperate for something more than the narrow life she had been living, could never have imagined how rich and full her life would become. The struggles had been real and often terrible, but they had led to something precious beyond measure. "You ever wonder about the other life you might have lived?" she asked Gideon. "If the drought had never happened, if you had married someone from La Junta instead of sending for a mail-order bride." "Never," he said firmly. "The drought brought you to me. Yes, it was terrible, but it was also the catalyst that changed everything. Without it, I might have continued alone indefinitely, too afraid to risk my heart again. The drought forced me to act, and that action brought you into my life. I would survive 100 droughts if that was what it took to find you." She turned to him in the darkness, finding his face with her hands, kissing him with all the love she felt. 15 years of marriage had not diminished the attraction between them, had not made their physical connection any less powerful. If anything, the deep knowledge they had of each other now made their intimacy even more profound. In the years that followed, they watched their children grow into adults and begin lives of their own. Samuel took over more and more of the day-to-day ranch management, preparing to inherit the operation someday. Elizabeth shocked everyone by becoming a teacher, one of the few women in the territory with formal education credentials. Jacob proved himself a natural horseman and started a side business breaking and training horses. Sarah, their youngest, showed an aptitude for business that impressed even her mother. Grandchildren began arriving, and the house rang with young voices once again. Penelope found she loved being a grandmother, enjoyed the sweetness of small children without the constant responsibility. She and Gideon would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching grandchildren play in the yard, and marvel at how their family had grown. 25 years, Gideon said on their anniversary in 1903. "A quarter century since you stepped off that stagecoach looking dusty and determined." "I was terrified," Penelope admitted. "Absolutely terrified. I had no idea what I was walking into." "But you walked into it anyway. That is what I have always admired most about you, your courage to act even when afraid." They were older now, with gray in their hair and lines on their faces earned from years of sun and wind and laughter. But their love had not aged, had not diminished, had only grown richer and deeper with time. "You told me I was the rain you had been praying for," Penelope said. "Do you remember?" "I remember everything about that day," Gideon replied. "Every word, every moment. You were the answer to prayers I had not known how to pray. And you gave me a life I had not known to dream of. We saved each other, Gideon. We did, and we would do it again." As the sun set over the ranch they had built together, over the life they had created from nothing but hope and determination and love, Penelope rested her head on Gideon's shoulder and felt completely content. The mail-order bride who had arrived during a drought had become the matriarch of a thriving family, the co-owner of a prosperous ranch, and the beloved wife of a good man. She had been the rain he prayed for, but he had been her answer too, the home and purpose and partnership she had been seeking. Together they had weathered every storm, survived every drought, and built something that would last for generations. Years continued to turn, and they grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love never wavering. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The ranch had grown beyond anything they could have imagined that first terrible year, a testament to what determination and partnership could achieve. When Gideon died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Penelope held his hand and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for loving me." She followed him 3 years later, having lived a full and rich life, having known love and purpose and the satisfaction of work well done. On her gravestone, beside Gideon's, their children inscribed words that told their story simply but perfectly. Partners in life, partners in love, together they made the desert bloom. The ranch continued under Samuel's guidance, and then his children's, carrying forward the legacy Gideon and Penelope had built. The story of the mail-order bride who arrived during the drought and the cowboy who called her his rain became family legend, told to each new generation as an example of what love and determination could accomplish. And on summer evenings, when rain finally came after dry spells, the family would stand on the porch of the old house and watch it fall, remembering the two people who had refused to give up, who had loved each other through the hardest of times, and who had built something lasting from dust and hope and unwavering devotion. Their love story had been born in drought, but had bloomed into something beautiful and enduring, a testament to the power of choosing each other, day after day, year after year, through every trial and triumph. They had been each other's rain, each other's salvation, each other's great love, and their legacy lived on in every green field, every thriving grandchild, every drop of rain that fell on the land they had fought so hard to save.